Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take complex global dynamics, unpack the source material, and transform dense information into clear, confident knowledge.
Today, we are undertaking a really critical and I think educational deep dive.
Absolutely.
Our core mission is to meticulously explore the complicated relationship between the United States and Venezuela.
And we're looking at this through three main lenses, right?
Exactly. Through sanctions, oil, and the underlying power dynamics that connect them both.
And we should be clear, our focus here is purely on understanding the mechanics of this relationship.
Yes, we're giving you the detailed context you need to follow these kinds of advanced geopolitical discussions. Not taking sides, just laying out the facts as presented in our sources.
That's right. And for you, the listener, when you commit to listening calmly to complex, long-form content like this, you're not just absorbing facts.
Not out.
You are, significantly improving your ability to connect sophisticated concepts and identify these complex cause and effect relationships in English.
It's a fantastic way to build that listening patience and vocabulary.
We've got a stack of sources here detailing policy shifts, economic reports, and even some operational specifics.
Yeah.
So let's get into it.
Before we jump into the conflict itself, we really need to establish the necessary context just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Okay, so where is Venezuela and why does its location matter?
Well, it's strategically positioned in northern South America. This gives it direct access to the Caribbean Sea.
Which is a vital artery for global shipping and trade.
A huge one. And maybe even more importantly, historically, Venezuela has been a titan in the oil world.
A giant.
A major global producer and what we'd call a powerful resource state.
And that historical role, that brings us immediately to a key concept we'll be talking about a lot today. Influence. We often think of influence in terms of, military might or armies.
Right, tanks and planes.
But in global politics, influence is, it's fundamentally about how a country can affect others through its resources.
Or its strategic position. And Venezuela had both.
And its vast oil wealth has ensured it remains a focal point, a center of gravity in global energy calculations and diplomatic maneuvering for decades.
Precisely. Oil-rich nations possess a kind of automatic leverage in global markets.
Why is that?
Because oil remains the indispensable primary energy source for industrialized economies. You can't run a modern country without it.
So that creates these deep economic interdependencies.
Exactly, linking the U.S. and Venezuelan economies through trade, but also, often, through inevitable diplomatic tension.
Or outright disagreement when political goals start to diverge.
That's when the trouble starts.
The recent intensification of attention on this relationship isn't really driven by a single crisis, is it?
No, it's more about significant systemic shifts. Changes in global energy priorities, ongoing diplomatic pressure campaigns.
And, the sheer economic necessity felt by both sides. All of this has brought the relationship back into the spotlight.
Which is why this deep dive is so essential right now.
All right, so let's start at the foundation of this conflict, which has to be Venezuela's oil wealth.
To really understand the tension, we absolutely must start with the economic structure of Venezuela itself.
Okay.
The country holds some of the world's largest proven oil reserves.
And let's clarify that term, proven reserves. That's not just oil they think they have, right?
No, that's a critical distinction. It's the measured, verified amount of crude known to exist underground and, importantly, recoverable with current technology.
So it's real and it's accessible.
Yes. And this single resource defined the nation for a century.
It became the singular central engine of the entire economy.
It shaped everything. National development, political decisions, for generations. This wasn't just a resource.
It became the only thing that mattered.
It did. Historically, the government relied overwhelmingly on oil sales for its entire income stream, its entire international trade balance.
And that reliance, it showed up in one primary way, right? Exports.
Massive exports.
Right.
Venezuela sold hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil daily to global consumers.
And in exchange for that oil, they got what?
Crucial foreign income. It's often called hard currency, usually U.S. dollars.
And this hard currency, this was the foundation of the government's ability to function at all.
To do anything. Because that foreign income paid for absolutely necessary imports.
And again, we're not just talking about luxury goods here. We're not talking about fancy cars.
No, we are talking about food, pharmaceutical components, spare parts for internal infrastructure.
Like the power grid or water systems.
Exactly. Things the country had simply ceased producing domestically.
Why?
Because the oil revenue made it easier and cheaper to just buy them from other countries.
And this leads us to a critical structural vulnerability, a word you're going to hear a lot: dependency.
Yes. In economics, this is often called the resource curse, or more specifically in oil-producing states, the Dutch disease.
What does that mean in simple terms?
It means relying so heavily on one primary export that all the other domestic economic sectors,
Like manufacturing or agriculture?
they get neglected, or they just collapse because they can't compete with cheap imports that are bought with all those oil dollars or petrodollars.
So it's like building an entire national economy on a single large pillar.
That is the perfect analogy, and here's where it gets really interesting, because that dependency is a double-edged sword.
How so?
When oil prices were high, say in the 1970s or the early 2000s, Venezuela was incredibly wealthy. Life was good.
But what happens when that one large pillar holding up the entire building begins to erode?
Then you have a structural crisis. And the erosion is, well, it's structural. It's not just about the price of oil.
What do you mean?
A lot of Venezuela's oil is often heavy and acidic. It's not the light, sweet crude that's easy to process.
So it's more difficult to refine.
And more expensive. It requires complex refining processes and, crucially, specific imported additives or diluents to make it thin enough to be exported efficiently.
So they need to import things just to be able to export their main product.
Precisely. So when global prices drop, or when political mismanagement cuts investment in the state oil company,
The technical process of extraction and export becomes exponentially more difficult.
and more expensive, which creates a vicious cycle.
Explain that cycle for us,
Okay. Lower production capacity means fewer exports,
which means less foreign income.
which means less money to buy the spare parts and the diluents needed to maintain the remaining production capacity.
It's a self-reinforcing downward spiral.
Exactly. The country found itself entirely reliant on selling oil just to buy the very inputs required to sustain oil production.
So that massive reserve of oil went from being this incredible asset to a strategic weakness.
A huge strategic weakness, one that external powers like the United States could exploit through targeted economic measures.
So to summarize this foundational section, Venezuela's vast reserves led to near-total economic dependency.
Which in turn created these acute structural vulnerabilities in both production and national maintenance.
And this set the stage for external pressure to be applied.
Which is precisely what sanctions are designed to do.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So let's turn to that tool of pressure. Let's really understand sanctions.
That economic dependency we just talked about is precisely why the U.S. chose sanctions as its primary lever of influence.
Right, it's the weak point.
It's the weak point. So let's move beyond the simple definition. Sanctions are official, calculated actions by one or more countries to impose limits.
Or restrictions.
Yes, restrictions on the economic activities of another state.
The key distinction here, I think, is that sanctions represent a policy framework.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a planned, often bureaucratic approach designed to influence a government's behavior without, and this is key, without engaging in overt military conflict.
They are rules controlling trade, finance, and investment, not weapons or soldiers.
And this clarification is really crucial, isn't it?
It is, because while military conflict uses physical force and immediate violence,
Sanctions use the sophisticated leverage of global financial and trade systems. They're an indirect method of pressure.
they are. And they're often described as a peaceful alternative, even though their impacts
Their systemic results.
can be incredibly severe, gradually crushing the economic ability of the targeted state.
And the sophistication lies in how they work.
Yes. The U.S. uses its dominant position in the international financial system to do this.
Specifically, the U.S. dollar's role as the global reserve currency.
That's the linchpin. If a Venezuelan entity is sanctioned, it essentially gets locked out of the global economy.
How so?
It can't access U.S. banks, it can't clear transactions in U.S. dollars,
Which is how most international trade is done.
and it often faces what are called secondary sanctions.
What are those?
That's when the U.S. penalizes any non-U.S. company that continues doing business with the sanctioned Venezuelan entity.
So it's a way of telling the rest of the world, if you do business with them, you can't do business with us.
And that is a devastating mechanism against a petrostate, a country that relies on oil.
Because oil is primarily traded and insured using U.S. dollars and the U.S. financial system.
Exactly. Restricting this access makes it virtually impossible for the targeted country to sell its core goods, receive legitimate payment, or conduct business through traditional secure channels.
And our sources confirm these are not sudden, dramatic measures. They're not like flipping a switch.
No, they're introduced step by step. It's a gradual tightening of the screws.
Initially targeting individuals.
Yes, then specific state-owned companies like the national oil company PDVSA.
And then finally, broader sectors of the economy.
This gradual approach allows for continual adjustment and increased pressure over time. It forms a cohesive and an escalating policy framework.
So what are the official objectives? What does the U.S. government say it's trying to achieve?
Well, the officially stated goals are consistently about encouraging specific political and economic changes.
So applying pressure on key nodes of state power, like the oil revenue.
To force a fundamental shift in leadership decisions while maintaining the non-military nature of the engagement, that's the official line.
But the implementation and the results demand a balanced perspective.
Always. Supporters will certainly view sanctions as a necessary, calibrated response to political concerns. A signal that international standards must be upheld.
That's the argument, yes.
But critics, and there are many, vehemently argue that the true economic consequences often extend far beyond the policymakers and the targeted regime.
They argue that these measures directly and disproportionately harm the civilian population.
By crippling the very infrastructure needed to provide basic goods and services.
So to maintain an impartial analysis, as we always do, we must use neutral language.
Right. We say supporters argue or critics contend.
It's essential to differentiate between the stated policy goals and the actual policy outcomes. Sanctions are powerful tools, and their application reveals these deep tensions between geopolitical strategy and humanitarian concerns.
Okay, so that leads us directly into the next section, the real-world impact, the economic and humanitarian effects.
When we connect the structural vulnerability of dependency from Section 1
with the economic pressure of sanctions from Section 2, we start to see the real-world system-level effects begin to compound. And these effects influence daily life gradually, like a slow-moving systemic failure.
It's not one sudden event. It's a slow decay.
Exactly. And the most visible failure is often hyperinflation.
Let's define that. We all know what inflation is, a general increase in prices. But what's hyperinflation?
Hyperinflation is an accelerating runaway condition where prices can double or triple within a single month, or even faster.
And that happens because the sanctions starve the country of hard currency.
Yes, the foreign income, those dollars that are needed to stabilize the local currency and pay for essential imports.
And when the local currency loses its value so dramatically, people need, wheelbarrows of money just to buy simple necessities.
We've seen the pictures. It's not just theoretical.
Yeah.
And we see how this crisis limits access to fundamental goods and services.
How does that work?
Well, sanctions restrict trade routes, making imported products scarce. But they also prevent the state oil company from importing the necessary spare parts and specialized equipment to keep internal systems running.
So you're talking about knock-on effects.
Huge knock-on effects. Think about it. If the electrical grid relies on imported parts that the sanctioned state cannot purchase,
Then power outages become frequent.
which then cripples water purification systems, hospital equipment, communication networks, it's a slow, systemic decay caused by that lack of hard currency.
This brings us squarely to the humanitarian disaster risk.
It's a very serious risk.
Venezuela is dependent on importing food and medical supplies.
Completely dependent.
So if the U.S. successfully cuts off the flow of hard currency derived from oil, the government loses the ability to pay for these essential imports.
And analysts have warned that such a sudden cutoff could rapidly destabilize the social fabric,
Risking massive outmigration.
which we've already seen, with millions leaving the country.
Or even accelerating the potential for civil conflict, which is mentioned in our sources.
Furthermore, these restrictions immediately affect employment conditions across the country.
The oil industry and all the related sectors are the largest employers.
By far. So when these industries can't export, can't invest, and can't secure financing, they slash operations.
So job availability just plummets.
It does. Wages stagnate or, more likely, they fail to keep pace with hyperinflation, which means they're effectively worthless.
And the overall stability, that feeling of predictability in daily life, it just evaporates.
It does. People lose confidence in the future.
So what we're observing is how this economic pressure doesn't just affect the government's treasury.
No, it affects the entire infrastructure of daily existence.
Sanctions create financial pressure.
That pressure propagates through critical systems like currency and logistics.
And those systemic failures slowly erode stability,
Yay.
creating a powerful, if indirect, mechanism for political change.
That's the theory behind it.
All right. Here's where it gets really interesting for me. We've defined the economic pressure, but now let's discuss the physical kinetic enforcement.
Yes, the shift in U.S. tactics to directly target the oil lifeline at sea.
This marks a dramatic intensification, right? We're moving from financial ledgers to ships on the ocean.
It's a huge shift. The U.S. has moved beyond just financial restrictions to actively intercepting and seizing vessels involved in carrying illicit oil.
And by illicit oil, you mean oil that violates U.S. sanctions.
Exactly. And this flow of illicit oil is carried by what are commonly referred to as shadow fleets.
Shadow fleets, that sounds ominous.
It is. These are tankers that often turn off their transponders, change their names, or use deceptive practices to hide their origin and destination.
And it's estimated that a huge portion of Venezuela's current exports rely on these ships.
Something like 80%. It's the only way they can get their oil to market.
And the political rhetoric has escalated right alongside the action.
It has. The U.S. president announced what he called a total and complete blockade.
Now, technically, experts debate that term. Is it a blockade, a quarantine, a high seas interdiction?
The legal definitions matter a lot in international law, but regardless of the technical term, the message is clear.
The U.S. will physically stop these oil exports.
And this focus on the oil lifeline is a strategic pivot.
A change from what they were doing before.
Yes. Previously, the U.S. targeted alleged narco-trafficking boats. Those actions were globally controversial, and Caracas called them violations of international law.
But the current emphasis is on the vast, liquid asset that directly funds the regime.
This is about cutting off the critical revenue stream. Pure and simple.
And we have seen specific, high-profile maritime actions that detail this pressure campaign. We have confirmed multiple vessel seizures.
We have. Let's look at the Panamanian motor tanker Centuries.
This was a massive vessel.
Huge, roughly 1,000 feet long. Owned by a Hong Kong-based entity, and it was seized after docking in Venezuela.
Now, the mechanism of the seizure is crucial for understanding the geopolitical subtlety here.
It is. This was often reported as a consented boarding.
What is that?
It means the crew of the tanker, upon being met by U.S. forces in international waters, agreed to allow the U.S. Coast Guard team aboard.
So it avoids the immediate complications of a hostile engagement or a forceful military intervention.
It de-escalates the situation immediately, at least on the surface.
And these operations are highly specialized.
Very. The boarding, search, and seizure are often executed by the elite MSRT.
The Maritime Security Response Team.
Of the U.S. Coast Guard. These are specialized law enforcement personnel.
They're known for their ability to fast rope from helicopters onto moving ships at sea. It's like something out of a movie.
It is. And it reflects the precision required for this kind of complex operation.
And here is a really important geopolitical nuance.
The legal status of the operators?
Right. The Coast Guard operates under rules of force.
Which is a law enforcement designation. It is not Title X military status.
And why is that distinction so absolutely vital?
Because using the Coast Guard frames the action as enforcing trade law and counter-narcotics regulations.
It minimizes the perception that the U.S. Navy is declaring an act of war or a military blockade.
Which carries significant international legal weight and could trigger treaty obligations for other countries. It's a very careful legal and diplomatic dance.
And to contextualize the frequency of this, the seizure of the Centuries followed the seizure of another tanker, the Sentry, just 10 days earlier.
Right. And we also have reports of active pursuit of a third unnamed oil tanker, as well as an empty tanker called the Bella One.
So this highlights a continuous, dynamic presence in the region. It's designed to choke off the supply routes.
A persistent presence. And while the Coast Guard focuses on enforcing sanctions and searching ship logs for evidence of violations, the risk of escalation is always there.
Even if Venezuela's Navy is significantly outmatched by the U.S. Navy.
The threat isn't necessarily a large-scale naval battle. The real risk lies in a miscalculation, a confrontation at sea, or what analysts call hybrid warfare.
What does that mean?
Actions by proxy forces, or the use of nimble asymmetric tools like seaborne or airborne drones.
And we only need to look at the recent conflict in Ukraine for an example of that.
A perfect and sobering example. A superior navy was challenged and, in some cases, defeated by a nimble, capable, adaptive foe, using these exact tools.
So the potential for unexpected kinetic responses always accompanies a blockade, however it's legally framed.
Always. But the immediate effect of this intensified enforcement has been profound.
What have we seen?
Reports showed that after the initial seizure of an early tanker, the Skipper, numerous other oil tankers around the world that were on their way to Venezuela abruptly stopped.
Or just turned around.
They turned around. This demonstrates the immense psychological and financial leverage the U.S. holds.
So even just the threat of seizure is enough to paralyze the financial lifeline of the Maduro government.
It's enough to deter the shadow fleet operators who don't want to lose their multi-million-dollar ships.
Okay, let's pivot from those operational details to the bigger picture, the strategic objectives. What is the end game here?
The overarching goal of this entire pressure campaign is, it's explicit, to completely sever the vital financial lifeline for the Maduro government.
A lifeline which relies heavily on oil revenue.
Supplemented by drug proceeds. The goal is to make it impossible for the government to remain solvent and maintain control.
Let's break down those two revenue streams being targeted. First, drug revenue.
Right. Maritime smuggling is the established primary route for moving cocaine out of Venezuela.
And we should be clear, Venezuela is primarily a transshipment point, not a major producer of cocaine.
Correct. But kinetic strikes and patrols against drug-laden boats have already put a massive dent in this revenue stream.
So now the second and primary focus is oil revenue.
Exactly. By aggressively seizing tankers linked to shadow fleets or to Russia or Iran, the government's ability to generate that hard currency is severely diminished.
And this reduction in cash flow directly impacts their ability to do what?
To pay the security and military forces. These are the fundamental pillars holding the regime in power.
So without loyalty that is purchased by continuous payment, the regime's foundation becomes dangerously unstable.
That's the theory of change. If you can't pay your army, you don't have an army for long.
And this dynamic brings us to the core issue, the competing justifications for U.S. action.
There are several layers here.
The official justification often centers on combating narco-terrorism.
Yes. We have quotes from officials like Secretary Kristi Noem, for instance, who explicitly stated that the illicit oil movement is directly funding narco-terrorism in the region.
So that frames the action as a security measure against illegal global networks, a law and order issue.
But many analysts, and even some officials speaking off the record, believe this is a thin veneer for a deeper political goal.
Which is regime change.
Regime change. The hope is that the sustained economic pressure will force Nicolas Maduro from power, triggering some kind of political transition.
So the seizures and financial restrictions are designed to be so suffocating.
That they encourage those surrounding Maduro to conclude that the only way to save their own skins and their own assets is to remove him themselves.
Then there's a third, more raw justification that we've seen in our source material.
The one about resources and reclamation.
Yes. Our sources cite the U.S. president explicitly stating his view. I'm quoting here. They took our oil.
Right.
We all a lot of oil there. As you know, they threw our companies out and we want it back.
And that is not a subtle diplomatic statement.
Not at all. It suggests a clear desire to regain access, land rights, and commercial opportunities that were lost when U.S. energy companies were previously expelled from Venezuela.
So this complexity means the U.S. policy is pursuing at least three goals simultaneously.
Security, which is the drugs and terrorism angle.
Political transition, which is regime change.
And resource access.
So what does this suggest about the potential for further escalation?
Well, a full-scale military invasion is widely deemed highly improbable.
Primarily because of Venezuela's size and population. It's a huge difference compared to, say, the 1989 Panama invasion. The logistical and human costs would be astronomical.
However, the probability of what our sources call possible kinetic actions remains high.
What does that mean exactly?
It means targeted, decisive strikes, likely using missiles or drones aimed at taking out critical regime infrastructure.
So things like surface-to-air missile sites, key airstrips, or command and control centers.
Exactly. These actions wouldn't be about invasion. They'd be about sending a powerful, unambiguous signal of capability and intent to try and force a political resolution.
Finally, we absolutely have to look at the global power dynamics. This isn't happening in a vacuum.
No, because the flow of Venezuelan oil has major geopolitical ramifications.
Venezuelan oil is a lifeline for key U.S. rivals and strategic adversaries.
Most notably China and Cuba.
The Cuba connection is particularly salient for many U.S. policymakers, especially those focused on Latin America, like Senator Marco Rubio.
Explain that connection.
If the U.S. can successfully and completely stop the flow of cheap oil from Venezuela to Cuba, it could severely destabilize the Cuban economy.
Which would achieve a separate strategic objective for those policymakers, all through the pressure applied to Caracas.
It's a two-for-one deal, in their view.
And we can't ignore the connection to Russia and Iran.
Not at all. Many tankers seized or targeted by the U.S. Coast Guard are linked to these global shadow networks that are also violating sanctions on behalf of Russia or carrying Iranian oil.
So this effectively folds the US-Venezuela conflict into the broader global U.S. strategy aimed at containing these major international rivals.
It becomes another front in a larger geopolitical contest.
And this explains why the international responses vary so widely.
It's not a simple issue. Countries with significant economic ties to Venezuela, or those geopolitically aligned with Russia or China, they push back against the U.S. sanctions.
While other countries, maybe prioritizing regional stability or energy market security, might remain neutral or quietly support the pressure.
It's a dynamic, multi-layered conflict that really exposes the deep interdependency of global affairs.
Okay, let's step back for a moment and synthesize this highly detailed conversation. We want to extract 4 core transferable lessons for you, the listener.
And we're focusing on the structures and systems at play in modern geopolitics.
That's lesson 1.
Lesson 1. Power beyond military strength. This conflict emphatically demonstrates that power in the international system is not solely defined by the size of a military budget.
Or the number of aircraft carriers.
Right. It relies fundamentally on economic influence, on the control over resources, and the ability to leverage global financial architecture.
And Venezuela's story shows how even having vast natural resources is not a guarantee of security.
In fact, they can be a source of critical vulnerability to external economic pressure.
And this ties directly into the structures of global systems. Resources create power structures that can be exploited by those who control the financial networks.
Lesson 2. Influence is gradual and systemic.
What do you mean by that?
Influence, particularly the kind exercised by the U.S. in this scenario, is rarely about a direct command. It's not one country telling another what to do.
Instead, it involved creating systemic conditions and pressures that guide decisions over time.
Yes. The U.S. exercises influence through these carefully calibrated economic mechanisms like sanctions, coupled with diplomatic engagement and strategic physical positioning, the maritime blockade.
It's a slow, steady, calculated pressure designed to force an eventual tipping point.
It's about leveraging the interdependencies we discussed earlier. The gradual removal of access to spare parts or the ability to process payments in dollars is far more effective than a single dramatic declaration.
Okay, that makes sense. What's lesson 3?
Lesson 3. Diplomacy as a long conversation.
Even when there are high-pressure tactics, like seizing ships.
Especially then, even those tactics are part of an extended diplomatic dialogue. Diplomacy is a long process involving continual communication, evaluation, and constant adjustment.
And these recent escalations, the tightening of the blockade, the specific targeting of shadow fleets, those are strategic adjustments.
Exactly. They reflect evolving economic needs or strategic opportunities. And the use of negotiation, even just discussing narrow, immediate issues like prisoner exchanges or temporary oil waivers.
It allows countries to maintain a channel of communication, even when the fundamental disagreements remain unbridgeable.
It shows that even when a conflict is economic or political, the conversation never truly ends. It just shifts its format.
And finally, lesson 4.
Lesson 4. Critical thinking is essential. We really encourage you, the listener, to practice critical observation when you read news about international conflicts.
Don't just accept the headlines or the official justifications at face value.
Ask how influence is structured. Ask how resources create vulnerabilities and how the various competing interests we've discussed,
Narcoterrorism, regime change, resource reclamation.
how they all interact to shape the final policy.
The ultimate goal is to move past the emotional rhetoric and the oversimplification.
To allow you to identify the underlying structural and systemic patterns that define modern global politics. That is the essence of advanced analysis.
A perfect summary.
As we conclude this complex deep dive, we hope this structured conversation has provided you with some real clarity on the situation in Venezuela.
Let's do a quick recap. Sanctions are sophisticated economic rules used to apply system-wide pressure.
Oil is the strategic economic connector that created both dependency and vulnerability.
And diplomacy is the ongoing, complex process of negotiation and strategic adjustment that manages this volatile relationship.
And by following this extended reasoning and the detailed analysis, you have actively strengthened your comprehension of complex English vocabulary and sentence structures.
We focus on concepts like influence, systemic vulnerability, adjustment, and perspective.
Handling this level of political and economic complexity is a key marker of advanced English proficiency, so well done for sticking with it.
We strongly encourage you to take a few moments after this to summarize these findings in your own words.
Pay attention to the nuanced vocabulary we used, like interdependency, kinetic actions, and policy framework. This active practice really builds confidence in communicating about highly technical and abstract concepts.
And finally, a provocative thought for you to mull over that builds directly on our discussion of the long-term risks.
We established that the U.S. is applying immense targeted economic pressure by severing Venezuela's financial lifeline to accelerate regime change.
So here's the question. If this economic pressure achieves its immediate goal and the Maduro regime falls, but it falls without a pre-planned, stable political transition in place, what happens next?
What are the second and third order effects for the entire region?
Given the substantial risk of massive outmigration, infrastructural collapse, and the potential for civil conflict that we mentioned earlier.
What are the true long-term costs to regional stability and U.S. security interests if the current, albeit tense stability, completely shatters?
That is the unpredictable consequence hidden beneath the potential success of the immediate pressure campaign. Something to think about.